Let's dive right into this explainer and examine a haunting 20-year-old cold case that completely shook the Pacific Northwest. We're looking at a deeply unsettling tragedy from 2006 involving a beloved mother and daughter from Seattle. It's a mystery that has baffled law enforcement and absolutely captivated the true crime community on Reddit, primarily because of the terrifyingly random nature of the crime. You know, this chilling question from a Reddit user perfectly sets the stage for what we're about to unpack. It's a thought that kind of forces us to re-examine the safety of our most peaceful, isolated spaces. For outdoor recreationists, the wilderness is a dream, right? It's a place to escape. But the horrifying reality of this case is that someone's sanctuary became the backdrop for an absolute nightmare.
Section 1. A tragic detour.
Before we get into the hard evidence and all the theories, we really have to center on the victims. Mary Cooper was a beloved 56-year-old elementary school librarian, and Susanna was her 27-year-old daughter. Online commenters who actually knew Mary describe her as just this incredibly kind, sweet woman who personally sparked a lifelong love of reading in so many kids. And when we trace their steps, you see how a simple last-minute change of plans completely altered their fate. The mother and daughter were experienced hikers, and their original destination was in the Mount Pilchuck area. But because the trail was still covered in snow, they pivoted on the fly and decided to hit Pinnacle Lake in Snohomish County instead. They accessed a super remote trailhead that actually required driving about 6 miles up this treacherous, really rough road. And here is the horrifying reality of what happened next on that trail. Later that afternoon, other hikers found Mary and Susanna dead. Both had been shot in the head. Investigators stated it appeared to be a calculated ambush. Nothing was stolen, and officially, there were no known signs of sexual assault, though community discussions definitely note the brutal haste of the crime. That evening, David Stodden, Mary's husband and Susanna's father, went home only to be greeted by detectives delivering literally the most heartbreaking news imaginable.
Moving on to Section 2, Evidence and Interrogations.
Initially, the police investigation created this sort of illusion of clarity by focusing heavily on someone close to home. Instead of immediately broadening their search for a stranger out in the woods, law enforcement honed in on David Stodden. And this was a move that drew massive criticism from the community back then and still does from armchair detectives reviewing the case today. Now that number 3, that represents the amount of separate polygraph tests David Stodden endured. Early on, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office considered him a person of interest. He had a confirmed, rock-solid alibi, yet he took 2 initial polygraph tests that somehow came back inconclusive. It actually took over 12 years until he finally passed a 3rd polygraph in 2018 for the Sheriff's Office to officially clear his name.
As you can imagine, the online community heavily criticized the authorities for wasting over a decade on what they call polygraph theater. Users express intense frustration, pointing out that polygraphs aren't true lie detectors anyway. They're often just used as interrogation tools to rattle suspects. The overwhelming consensus here is that law enforcement wasted precious time looking at the husband when they absolutely should have been focusing strictly on the physical evidence left at the crime scene. So the crucial point here is separating what investigators actually have in their hands versus the details they're keeping closely guarded from the public. We know they recovered shell casings at the scene, which allowed them to identify the potential make and model of the firearm, reportedly a rifle. However, they've deliberately withheld that specific firearm information from us. What we do know they have, though, is biological evidence.
And this is where it gets incredibly real. They found a partial male DNA profile during Susanna Stodden's autopsy. Commenters note that this touch DNA, which was reportedly found under Susanna's fingernails, strongly suggests she fought back against her attacker. While this microscopic trace hasn't led to a suspect just yet, it remains one of the absolute most tangible clues in the entire investigation.
All right, Section 3, Theories on the Trail. When you look at the extreme isolation of that trail and the specific method of the murders, human nature just demands that we try to make sense of it. Sifting through massive Reddit threads, the true crime community generally categorizes the suspects into 3 distinct profiles. We have the opportunistic predator, the traveling killer, like Israel Keys, and the wrong place at the wrong time theory, like a drug deal gone bad. Let's break these down one by one.
So theory number 1 is by far the most widely supported. It suggests a local or semi-local who was already up there with a rifle. Some locals have actually mentioned there's a backwoods shooting range not far from this trail. The theory goes that someone was out there shooting recreationally or hunting, watched the women arrive, saw a highly isolated window of opportunity, and simply took it.
And honestly, this logic brilliantly illustrates why it couldn't have been a targeted hit by someone who knew them. Remember step 1, Mary and Susanna changed their plans that very morning because of the snow. For someone to specifically target them, they would have had to follow them all the way from Seattle, which makes zero sense. The trail was isolated enough for the killer to have a small window of total control, and their familiarity with the rough terrain let them escape without panicking. It really points to a terrifyingly random, violent encounter.
Now, Theory 2 casts a much wider net. Many people wonder if it was a highly mobile serial killer like Israel Keyes. Keyes was actually known to have been in the general area around that time, and his whole thing was specifically hunting in remote areas, targeting complete strangers with whom he had absolutely no prior connection. It perfectly fits the profile of a killer with serious outdoor confidence who strikes and then just vanishes. But there's a huge catch here, and armchair detectives are quick to point out a major departure in methodology. Keyes was incredibly meticulous about hiding the bodies of his victims. In the Pinnacle Lake case, Mary and Susanna were left right where they fell on the trail. Because of this major discrepancy, the FBI has reportedly called his direct involvement highly unlikely. That said, the community agrees it very well could be a Keyes-like killer, a one-and-done traveler who committed the act and then seamlessly assimilated back into normal life. The final popular theory is that the women stumbled upon a crime in progress, maybe a drug deal or something they just shouldn't have seen, and were killed simply to eliminate witnesses. I mean, it gives a logical, albeit deeply tragic motive to an otherwise completely senseless act.
But let's think about this geographically for a second, because it quickly dismantles the whole idea. As one user pointed out, criminals generally want customers, not a strenuous hike. A trail that requires a treacherous 6-mile drive just to reach the parking lot, followed by an actual hike, is a literally terrible place to conduct business. The logistics make a drug deal highly implausible.
Which brings us to Section 4, Waiting for Justice.
Nearly 20 years have passed, and while the trail has technically gone cold, detectives are putting their hope in the rapid advancements in genetic genealogy to re-examine untested items from the scene. This powerful statement from Detective Bilio shows exactly where law enforcement's head is at today. Sure, the initial investigation had its flaws and misdirections, but the current commitment is entirely about giving David Stodden, his family, and the Snohomish County community the closure they so desperately deserve.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we are left looking at the science. Will that microscopic trace of touch DNA, fought for by Susanna in her final moments, be the key? It leaves us with a lingering, deeply unsettling thought. A killer took 2 innocent lives in the quiet of the woods, and has just walked freely among us for 2 decades. Will advancing technology finally pull them out of the shadows?